Hello, and welcome to Conversations at the Washington Library, a podcast about early American history and the people who teach it. I am your host, Dr. Joe Stoltz, and this episode we are going to have the second half of our interview between Mount Vernon's president and CEO, Doug Bradburn, and Gordon Wood, Emeritus Professor of History at Brown University. In this half of the interview, they are mostly going to be talking about Dr. Wood's new book, Friends Divided, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And without further ado, now we join Drs. Wood and Bradburn in the second half of their interview.
Okay, so let's talk then about your latest book, which is the Jefferson and Adams book. No doubt that's what you've been mostly talking about when you're making the rounds here. So if you don't, want to spend too much time
on it,
I
am happy to.
We can go back to. So why did you decide you wanted to do Jefferson?
Well, I had just finished editing 3 volumes of the Adams writings for the Library of America.
Right. Yeah.
And I thought I would write about Adams because he fascinates me. And
is that because he's a New Englander, or because he's a crotchety guy?
Yeah, crotchety guy, and he takes on all the American myths. But at any rate, my publisher. At Penguin said, why don't you do a comparison? And suddenly that struck me as what I ought to do. And I'm glad I did, because I think comparing the two men illuminates both of them better than if you just focused on one.
Well, they have such a great end together. Obviously, they died
that,
the same
of course,
day.
But
I mean the friendship at the end, or the correspondence at least at the end.
Right. No, that's interesting. But what really fascinates me is how different they are from one another. All the way from the physical to the temperament to their assumptions about human nature to their views of society to their views of government to their views of religion. I can't think of anything that they don't differ on. The only thing that really they had in common, well, aside from their acceptance of the revolution and their belief in the greatness of the United States, is their hatred of Alexander Hamilton. They both hated him.
Is that what drove them back together again?
Well, it certainly gave them something in common that they could. Because for that reason, Adams is never a Hamiltonian Federalist. He's a halfway Federalist. He's halfway between the Republicans and the hardcore Federalists, and so
he never trusted the financial system.
Right, and he and his son really become accepting of the Republicans. In fact, John Quincy, of course, becomes a Republican,
right?
Knowing the future, and he was burned by the Federalists because they took him out of the Senate after of course, he's supporting the embargo, he's supporting the Louisiana Purchase, he's supporting these Republican things, and they're not going to, the Federalists of Massachusetts just vote him out.
Yeah, well, at a certain point, if it quacks and walks like a duck, it's a duck.
And then he became a Republican, and then of course they make him minister, and then finally Monroe makes him Secretary of State, and he becomes probably our best Secretary of State.
It seems like Jefferson was flirting with working more amiably with Adams at the beginning of Adams' presidency, but Madison kind of talks him out of it.
Well, he naively thought that maybe because people were so excited, it was just, oh my God, with the two parties, one the Federalist and one the vice president of Republican, this will bring just our dream today, bipartisanship. And he writes a letter proposing that somehow he collaborate with Adams, and he says, well, before I send this, I should check with my friend Madison, and Madison says, don't send it. He felt that this was naive, and it was, because the parties were too different. I mean, they were forces that went beyond the personalities that he wasn't taking into account of, and he said, this letter will prove embarrassing to you as the forces develop, you'll find. And so Jefferson agrees and doesn't send the letter.
So it seems like, correct me here, I'll make some statements. So Adams, it seems, is at the Continental Congress is sort of, where he's developing his rapport with Jefferson, I guess, the first time. He seems to be more politically astute than the Adams that we see later in the presidency, more willing to work with people.
He's on 20 committees, which is one of the reasons he let Jefferson write the draft of the Declaration, because he's on 20 committees and he's chairing many of them, including the War Committee. I mean, he's very busy, and he's devoted to independence. I mean, he's just trying to, in that sense, he does step on toes, with Dickinson and others. He gets into But
But I guess
because
he
he's on
wins
the
those
right
arguments,
side
yeah.
of the thing, and he's in the leadership. I mean,
Yeah.
he realizes, however, I can't push too far because I'll offend. So he restrains himself a little bit, and he pushes, Washington as the commander in chief, because he knows that he's offensive to a lot of people,
Yeah.
and that the Massachusetts delegation he doesn't want it to be too far out in front.
Yeah.
And so
I
he
mean,
has enough
from his
savvy.
point of view, I mean, and I think without the power of hindsight, the idea that New England might be left alone is a very powerful.
Yeah, no, he
reality.
definitely, and he uses the notion of a convoy. He says a convoy has to. He says we're like a convoy, and you have to go. The convoy has to go with the slowest ship, and you
Yeah.
can't go faster than the slowest ship. And he uses that metaphor, and I think that
It's a beautiful metaphor.
right, it is.
yeah.
It shows exactly how much he did have some political
Some
sense.
savvy.
But later he loses that because he somehow gets so wrapped up in his own sense of what's needed, and he's so scared of what the society is becoming that I think
Yeah.
he really thought we were going down the hell in the handbasket, the corruption,
Yeah.
factionalism. We're going to have to go to a hereditary Senate and president. God forbid if he were here today, he would say we're ready for that now.
Yeah.
A hereditary Senate and it's the only thing that will save us from our electoral system.
One of the things that was so I think impactful from the creation book, your first book, was the section on Adams in which he's
Right.
the irrelevant John Adams.
Well, I
'cause
got
he basically missed
it got misinterpreted.
Yeah.
The irrelevance. I also call it the relevance and the irrelevance.
Right,
Irrelevance.
right.
The
That's
relevance
right.
was his diagnosis of American society.
Yeah.
Completely caught up in competition and one-upmanship and so on. He really captured America better than anyone until Tocqueville. But the irrelevance came from his notion that the society was divided into states.
Yes, right.
a
So he
European
missed
style.
that shift
and he
of mind
didn't
that
understand that,
happened.
the senates were becoming double representations of the people. And in fact, all of the agents of government had become representative. He missed that point,
Yeah.
and of course it's easy to miss because we call houses of representatives. What is the Senate?
Yeah.
Originally, it was not a representative body. It was supposed to be just an embodiment. They had no constituents. They were
Right.
just to be the wise men. But people soon realized that was impossible. In fact, the Pennsylvanians, opposed to the unicameral legislature in Pennsylvania, argued for an upper house, and the opponents said, no, you're trying to foist a House of Lords on us. And he said, no, we just want a double representation of the people. Well, that's such amazing. If the people can be represented twice, well, then why not 3 times, 4 times? And that sure enough is what happened. And Hamilton uses this in 78, Federalist 78. He says, he's trying to justify judicial review. So he begins to argue, well, the judges, they're just as much an agent of the people as these state legislators.
Yeah.
Well, that's his argument. But he didn't foresee the consequences. If people begin to think of judges as agents of the people, then we better elect them. And sure enough, now by the Jacksonian period, they begin electing judges, and we now have 39 states that elect their judges. Now we can't do that to the federal because it's too difficult to change the Constitution. But if we could, people would start saying, "Let's elect the judges." I mean, what's fascinating to me is the way ideas change in these kinds of debates over the head, so to speak, of the participants. They scarcely know what they're doing.
Well, that's, I think, what was so compelling about that take on Adams, precisely because he's kind of out of the country, and he comes back, and he sort of missed the moment,
That's right.
And he's still in that model of, okay, you got to, each branch relates to each
Social
station in
orders,
life,
right.
we got to recreate the social order, and that's what balance means, instead of the balance of the jurisdictional
Exactly, and so
balance.
all of his colleagues who write to him saying, "I don't understand what you're talking about," he just gets frustrated, and that's what I meant by the irrelevance.
More
but
and
it was
more
too,
explanations
it was too
of
strong a
monarchical
term.
power. Yeah.
It was because historians picked it up and they couldn't figure out what I was
Oh,
saying.
I don't agree with that. I think
Well-
people figured it out. I think people have disagreed with it, but I think it makes the book. It really helps understand that shift
Well,
that you're trying to describe about basically a
Right.
science
Why
of politics.
Taylor is arguing with him,
Yeah.
John Taylor,
Yeah.
and Taylor is into the new thinking,
Yeah.
and they just they don't meet.
Yeah.
But that went on for quite a few years. And what's interesting is Taylor, at the end of his life, he's dying, and he realized his book was too late. He should have published it 20 years earlier. He took so long to write it. But he writes to Adams and thanks him for being such a, well, I don't know, being a contestant, taking his book seriously. No one else did. Taylor's style was so difficult that nobody was reading his book, but Adams did and responded, and they exchanged about 30 letters. I mean, so it's a poignant moment when he writes him and commends him for the debate that they've gone on with.
Adams loved that.
Yeah,
he
of
loved
course,
the
he loved
debate.
the
Did
debate.
anybody read Defense of the Constitutions?
That's the question.
Maybe in France, right? I mean, there was something.
Well, some people read it. Yeah, the French read it because they picked it up right away and said, "This is where he's wrong."
Tergot
and they had they had a good point that he's supporting
it's a British model.
Right, exactly, a British model of estates, and they had a good point.
Yeah,
Turgot had a good point.
So Jefferson and Adams, and so where does Jefferson fit into this arc? It's got to be it's a chronological challenge, I would imagine, writing it.
Well,
because maybe not. I guess they're
Jefferson
time.
actually
they die at the same time.
They died at the same time, but Jefferson was 8 years younger, and he deferred to Adams. One of the reasons they got along, especially in the constitutional, Continental Congress, was that Jefferson came in late, and there's the older man. He was only 8 years, but that can mean something. And Jefferson actually deferred to him, and Adams saw him as his protege, and so that really made him open to a friendship. And then, of course, the real friendship is bonded in Europe when the two families just intermingle. And Jefferson, takes John Quincy to a museum, go to the symphony together, and the two families and Abigail and Jefferson really they carry on a little flirtatious correspondence. He's buying when she and John go off to London as minister. He buys presents for her and sends them to London. I mean, there's a real friendship there.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned how different they were, but I guess one way that even Americans who are very different can feel the same as when they're in Europe, right? I mean,
right. Well, they're both Americans.
These are two Americans abroad, and so they have that bond.
But they couldn't differ more. I mean, Jefferson believed that all men are created equal, and he believed that literally, except all white men. And most Americans accepted that, and I think they still do. That is, the obvious differences that emerge as adults are due to different environments, different training. That's why education is so important to Jefferson and to the rest of us. Adams denies this. He's really taking it. He says, no, we're all born unequal.
So
and that inequality is there he didn't know about DNA and genes.
He's a nature over nurture guy.
Right. Yeah. He's a nature man all the way. And he tells Jefferson.
So his natural aristocracy, though, it wasn't based at all on any kind of social
context? It's good. Right. The wily guys will make it. The ones who are shrewd. I mean, he just had no confidence in that the talented and the virtuous are going to emerge. He had an iron law of oligarchy, and this has been touched on. This is nothing new. There's several books out on this point now. The question is, he does reach a point where he talks about, well, a man who can influence one other vote is an aristocrat. Well, that sort of democratizes aristocracy. He's talking about gentlemen. That's one of his distinctions, is that gentlemen, commoners, those are the aristocrats, the gentlemen.
Interesting.
If they're one out of 10 people, that's one thing. But if they're every third person's a gentleman, then it somehow gets diluted. And I think that's what's happening. He sees more and more people claiming the status of gentlemen.
Interesting.
And so that accounts for that strange remark. It comes late.
But Adams believes, though, in those kind of distinctions, gentlemen and others. There's a so here's a little anecdote that you probably know because you know it all, you've read it all. But in one of Rufus King's letters about meeting King George III, they start talking about Adams's first message to Congress, and George III says to King, this is through Rufus King's letters, that he likes Mr. Adams's address to Congress much better than he liked Washington's addresses to Congress, because Adams calls the members gentlemen, and Washington called them my fellow citizens. And
I didn't know about that, but that's interesting.
And the king sounds a lot like Adams, because he goes on then to talk about these little differences of distinction will matter in political comportment and public opinion, and Mr. Adams will be successful because of these, so it's like George III and Adams are cut from the same cloth.
Yeah, he would be sympathetic. I mean, Adams has this argument with Rush and with others about name call, titles and everything.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
and then he says people beginning to talk about first names. He says, "What do you mean first names?" Because they call each other Mr. Jefferson, Mr. Adams.
Right.
Even though, and he says, "What's it going to be?" And he says, "It's going to be Tommy Jefferson. It's going to be Freddie Muhlenberg, who's the Speaker of the House." Yeah. And of course, he would be appalled by today's world where there are no last names; there are only first names,
nor formal distinctions.
Right, and all the formalities gone. He would say, "Well, that's exactly what's happened. It's gone to pot. The whole world has gone to pot. Just what he expected."
Extraordinary. So they do seem to have one thing in common also, that they both very unorthodox legal minds. I mean, they aren't, I don't think, correct me, I don't think they don't pedantically sort of follow, they're sort of original thinkers when it comes to the law.
Well, Adams is in love with the common law, and Jefferson hates it. So there's a big difference. Yeah. Jefferson's legal training was boring to him, and he did it because, well, that's what planters do. As soon as his father-in-law leaves him with many more slaves and much more land, he stops the legal practice, which never interested him anyhow. It wasn't a source of his income. For Adams, it is the source of his income, and he comes to love the law, and Jefferson comes to hate it, hate the common law, and he hates the judges. He hates Marshall. He can't stand any kind of. Well, he hates judicial review. The whole notion that the judge should have. He would be a Scalia type conservative in that sense, because he believes the legislature should have the final say. Yeah. In fact, he doesn't believe the court has any monopoly of deciding what's constitutional. Adams is on the other side of that issue. He's very much into the common law and the mystery of the common law.
And the role of judges.
Yeah, and the role of judges. He's into the mystery of the common law, which, of course, is the source of judicial discretion, which is something that the Federalists favor. So they differ on their attitude towards law, and it's understandable, although Adams makes fun of Marshall's biography of Washington, which was the first great biography, 5 volumes.
Using his papers.
Yeah, well, 5 volumes was a little bit much, I guess. But it seemed,
I don't know if anyone read that either.
No. But so he makes fun of that, a mausoleum. But he, of course, is the one who appointed Marshall, and he has great respect for Marshall. And Jefferson does not. He's a bitter enemy of Marshall's.
Well, Jefferson, he starts putting together his political annals from all his diary entries and then other issues, in part as a response to Marshall's history in Washington in the 1790s. And
yes, he would occasionally take notes presumably immediately after a dinner party or something. And so some of our important incidents come from his annals.
So do you do much in the book with Jefferson and Adams's final correspondence? That relationship they develop through letters.
It's, Jefferson, Adams writes 3 times as many letters but Adams, it's interesting because at one point he says he knows that Jefferson's in a different league, a different celebrity league from him. And he says, well, how many letters do you get in a year, Mr. Jefferson? And Jefferson says, well, I got last year, 2000, I think it was 1820, I got 2,000 something. And Adams is appalled. He says, I get 200 something. So 10 times. And of course, Jefferson feels an obligation to answer them all. So he says, it's understandable why you only write, 1 to my 3. He says, I don't care. I says, I enjoy writing my 3. And of course, that's true. He really seems to enjoy the correspondence more. He's facetious, he's joking, he makes fun of things. In 1815, Napoleon's been defeated, the Bourbons are back on the throne in France, and so what does Adams say to Jefferson? What do you think of the French Revolution now, Mr. Jefferson? And of course, anyone else would have said, the hell with you, I'm not going to talk to you anymore. He doesn't. He puts up with this razzing. So Jefferson is patient and forgiving because he has to put up with a lot of this kind of what we call ribbing someone.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But it's done. He realizes that it's done in a friendly manner. But I'm not but he would have been willing to do that. Rush was willing to put up with it too, because Adams would treat Rush the same way. He would make these outrageous statements, and leaving Rush flabbergasted. But he knew that there was a warm heart on the other side, and I think that made
Adams continually mesmerizes historians, I think, because he leaves so much of himself in the letters. I mean, he's so much more open.
Right.
So many more members of that
his
generation.
heart on his sleeve. I mean, he's just an open book.
Yeah, and you've got Abigail's letters as well.
Right,
so you have a kind of a whole relationship in there.
And Jefferson's the opposite.
Yeah.
I mean,
so he's very standoffish.
Right. He's reserved, and
he's intellectual, right? I mean, he'll go on these sort of long.
Right, but he doesn't never let you know what he's really thinking, which is what led to his. He's very polite. He's actually obsessed by politeness, which was a very much part of the Enlightenment notions of politeness, civility, and so on. And he writes about this, and he tells his son-in-law and so on how important politeness is. But it leads to dissimulation, because you don't say things to people that you might say privately about them, and that leads to a sense that you're two-faced, and that was Jefferson's great problem. He always, he really never is open.
Well, here we're here in Mount Vernon, so we need to close our conversation talking about George Washington a little bit. And
Definitely.
Let's do it from the vantage of Jefferson and Adams. Now, Adams is one of the few who write openly criticizing Washington after his death, certainly.
He criticized him when he was alive.
He criticized him when he was alive.
He took him on during the war, 1777, in the
exactly.
Congress. I mean, it was just, he should never have done that, because Washington was too revered. I mean, but he was jealous of Washington.
He was. He seemed to think that as an armchair military man who was going to read books on martial arts now, so his son.
But he does ultimately respects him. He knows that he's superior to him. He's got that grudging respect. He had the gift of silence.
Yeah, he says that in his list of
that's important.
10 things.
He realizes that's the one thing he doesn't have himself.
Yeah.
And Washington he's impressed by Washington. There's no doubt of it. But he is jealous.
Well, and he also knows he's a human being and not an idol. And I imagine that must have gotten pretty old.
And he's very upset by the fact that Washington tries to serve without pay. He has a long correspondence on this point with an English friend.
Really?
About why people should be paid. Now, he's talking as a middle-class person, an origin. And of course, not serving without pay is very English. And of course, the members of Parliament are not paid till 1911. And Washington tries to keep that tradition. As commander-in-chief, he accepts no pay and tries to not take the salary as president. But they won't let him do that, because they realize that.
I think if he did, and
it was
just his expenses, I guess, taken care of. But because otherwise he. But
that's a big difference between them. Washington is still living. I mean, Adams is, for all of his monarchism and so on, he is foreshadowing a middle class world.
When is Adams born? So Washington, 1732.
1755, I think.
Oh, Adams, really?
No, that's his college graduation. He's born in 35.
Okay, so he's only a few years younger than Washington.
Right.
So he's more of a contemporary. I mean, Jefferson. Washington, Jefferson's 12 years old when Washington is already a war hero in Virginia.
Right, right.
So he's always going to have a different perspective.
Right. Jefferson's just a kid, as Adams says during the crisis through the Stamp Act and so on. He's barely out of diapers as far as Adams is concerned.
So what about Jefferson and Washington?
Well, they were close, obviously, in the early part, but during the administration, Washington comes to realize that Jefferson was not honest with him.
That's the worst thing you can do with Washington.
Yeah, and Hamilton is, of course, forthright and honest and upfront. And that makes all the difference. Jefferson again tries to. He just wriggles around and doesn't really come straight, and that hurts their relationship. It essentially kills it.
So as someone who's devoted a lot of their work to broad social trends over long periods of time and transformative cultural changes, ideological changes, What is the role of individuals in history?
Well, obviously they're important. And Washington was probably the most important. It certainly was the most important. Although I do have a sense that participants in the past are buffeted and controlled by forces they scarcely understand.
Yeah.
We live in a fog in a way,
Yeah.
and Washington experienced that. The fact that he came out of retirement in 1798 to lead
Huge
the
mistake.
army tells you that he was just confused by the world. It was going too fast. And one of his last letters that he writes to Trumbull, the Federalists wanted him to come out of retirement and run for the presidency against the French.
I know that
and then
letter.
he says, "Look, you could put a
broomstick.
broomstick up
Yeah.
and call it the Son of Liberty, and he'd win." I mean, he foresees the democratic politics where anybody can run for office,
Yeah.
and it's which is sad because all of these founders who live into the 19th century die disillusioned with what they have wrought. That is the saddest thing. The only one who died happy was Franklin because he died soon enough, 1790. So he doesn't experience the disillusionment that comes from essentially from democracy. They all see that this isn't really the world I expected.
Mm-hmm.
But that's true in any dynamic society. That's true of anyone who lives too long. That's right.
It does seem to be that case.
Right. That's why old people say, well, the world's going to hell in a handbasket because it's different from the world they grew up in.
Yeah.
And it seems to happen, so to speak, over your head, under your feet. That, to me, is a historical process. When you go back, you see the blindness of the actors, the confusion they're in. It's amazing. They're struggling, and so you have some sense of sympathy for them because they're struggling with forces they can barely understand.
Yeah, I think the study of history gives you a little more patience with the present.
Right.
Because the present is complicated and the past
and you need
has
some
always been
compassion for the people in the past because they didn't know the future. And to accuse them for not being like us is really that's the great sin.
Well, and it's sort of spitting into the wind. What's the point of it at a certain level?
What are people going to say about us 100 years from now?
Well, they'll remember you, Gordon Wood, for all of your literature.
You,
they won't say anything about Doug Bradburn.
They'll remember. Yes, they will. The director of the library at Mount Vernon.
That library. As Cromwell said to Parliament, "You've sat here too long." Right. So, thank you for your time, and I look forward to hearing more.